Hi everyone, Owen here from TASQ. This is a special episode you're about to see. Part of it is a recording taken from a masterclass delivered by the legendary Kevin Eastman. If you're watching this video, you probably already know Kevin as the co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Now, as part of this masterclass, we delivered it in two sections. The first is the recording you're about to see, in which Kevin delivers his secret origin, his inspirations, his breakthrough into industry, and of course what went in behind the creation of the Ninja Turtles with P.L. Laird. You will also hear about Kevin's collaboration in producing the Last Ronin series and its success. The reason for this particular video is because Kevin used a number of visuals in his presentation, so you can still listen to this episode wherever you get your podcasts. You can download and listen to the audio, but this video is a special presentation so that you can also watch and see some of the images used by Kevin in his presentation. So sit back, relax and enjoy, and if you enjoy what you see, consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.
Hey everybody, it's Kevin Eastman. I'm the co-creator of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I'm excited to be here with you today. I've never done one of these before, which for one of me is kind of exciting. So I also want to say, bear with me a little bit. I tend to talk a lot and can meander for this and that, which is good. I wanted to put together a slideshow, and it's similar to some of the ones I do at. This was designed specifically for you all, but parts of it are ones that I do at a comic convention when I do a panel. So I want to give fans of, whether new or old, a bit of a history, a little background, sort of replacement, sort of this is where things started for me in my dreams, and now I got to where I am. But for this one, I went through and picked out some of the systems of how I approach a project, how I approach what I've done as a project, and how I've arrived at some of the stories that you've seen and enjoyed these. Hopefully enjoyed these last 40 years, because just the idea when I was invited to do a masterclass, I immediately kind of took a step back because we go to the next slide. Here is this guy, and actually that the first slide I always show that because when I start a show, because I've been drawing comics for 40 years. Thanks to the Turtles, thanks to the fans that have supported them and given me the greatest job ever. I was literally drawing before I came on to talk with you. I'll be drawing when I get off. I've got deadlines still on Monday. I still actively love writing, drawing, and telling stories. And this is the guy that really is, for me, the ultimate inspiration for that. His name is Jack Kirby. I'm sure a lot of you know who he is. If not, he was co-creator of most of the Marvel Universe. I lean towards creator / co-creator as opposed to co-creator. He was an amazing storyteller. I think you can barely begin to count the number of characters that he did create and the people that he inspired. And to me, when I first discovered Kirby, it was, it was probably 10, 11 years old, growing up in a very small town in Maine and New England, and not a lot to do, so to speak. So Kirby was one of these storytellers that was very dynamic. His approach was very simple, but very dynamic, very exciting, almost written for a person of my age. And I really embraced the idea that if you could think about it and write it, and draw it as well, which was one of Kirby's greatest gifts, is he could do all of that, is that you could tell a story that would take you anywhere, past, present, future. And I just love that idea. It was something that was, I fully fell in love with. I had a lot of great drawings taken away in English class or math class. I got in trouble for not doing chores because I was up in my room drawing and trying to follow in the footsteps of Jack Kirby. And this one picture I show here is Pete and I actually got to meet him once. We get to meet him a number of times, but this is one of our treasured moments, is meeting the guy. And he was I love to tell the story, is that he was a big a kid as any of us then and now. He loved what he did, and When I first saw him at San Diego Comic-Con back in 1986, he had come into the convention center, and he was immediately surrounded by fans and asking him questions and offering praise. And one of the questions, by the time I got to where he was answering a question how him and Joe Simon created Captain America, and we were sort of hanging on every word. And then the next fan asked the question, and it was the same question. The fan was very nervous. He said, "So how did you create Captain America?" And Kirby did not take a second and make that person feel belittled or silly for asking the same question again. He answered it in the same loving tone and gave that fan such a special moment that one, you could tell he loved what he did, and two, that I always thought if I was lucky enough to have fans, I hope I treat them as well as Jack Kirby treated all of us. So Jack was an inspiration. It was something that Pete and I bonded over in the earliest days when we first met, and back in the early 80s. But I was also a fan of a number of other artists back in the day, mainstream artists from, John Buscema did, Conan, Sal Buscema did Captain America, George Tuska. There was so many that we love. Barry Smith's Conan the Barbarian. And when my earliest drawings, when I look back, and I still have them all here in boxes, especially in the early days, and I tell this to fans who often ask, how do I get from, say, that side of the convention table to my side of the convention table, drawing or writing. It was, don't be afraid to be inspired by the people that inspire you. I went as far as I traced drawings. I would have a comic book out, and I would trace Jack Kirby poses, and I would trace Barry Smith trees. And that's how I sort of learned how they made those things, the decisions of what to bring forward in a panel, what to push back in a panel, how important setting up a big scene to sort of, before you go to a series of, say, smaller panels telling your story, if you show a larger panel where the characters are and exist in the place and space they are, the action is taking place in, you sort of learn it because there's no school for comics. I did not go to a college for comics. The Cubic School, when I was growing up, didn't exist. And so it was, I'm pretty self-taught, and it was just something that, and it goes back to this idea of a masterclass. And I said, the masterclass should be called, for me, is Master of I don't know what I'm doing. But at the same time, it is instinctual, especially these days. When I was younger, it was, besides comics, it was TV shows like Star Trek, movies like Planet of the Apes, Wizard of Oz, things like that you saw that really pushed your imagination to these spaces and places. And the way those people chose to tell a story and move through those panels and made a good story good or a good story great was by making those decisions, which I sort of absorbed. And when we get into the next couple of sequences here, we can talk more about the application of that. I love showing this cover because it's the first issue, and it was, up until this time, Pete and I, who both Pete and I write and draw, had done our own stories. And when we met, we wanted to do that together. And so we had to work specifically on combining of styles and ideas. And it took a while for those things to blend fully. But we really pulled off all those inspirations I mentioned. And with the Turtles, it was really inspired by the most popular things in comics at that time for me and Pete, which was, you had Teenage Mutants from, the X-Men, New Mutants, superhero groups like the Fantastic Four or the Avengers, for example, the Forever People, things like Jack Kirby's Commandy, which was one of my favorites, which is kind of an extended version of Planet of the Apes, taking place on this world gone crazy where animals were now in control of the planet and the humans were more of the animals, the slaves. Frank Miller's Daredevil was a huge influence. He was one of the first people like Alan Moore and so many others around this time in the um, um, yes, early 80s, because they were underground comic books too, and I'll touch on those in a second. But they were had made the decision that they are adults and they like comics for adults. Comic books were long since controlled, except for European comics. Comics were regulated in the United States by the Comics Code Authority, and so they try to keep comics, regulated to 12-year-old boys and younger kind of thing. So when you had Frank Miller and Alan Moore and so many others at that time coming in and blending, their inspiration from European comics, even manga was starting to have an influence, and they wanted to write comics for adults, things that they would like to read, and that was something that we fully embraced. And with the Turtles, we really took a bit of all those favorite things and came up with this parody to not only write a book for ourselves, but write about the things that we loved in comic books. So it wasn't making fun. It was told very straightforward, but it had a lot of parody elements in it. And just to give you a little more perspective in history in the Turtles, and like I said, some of you might know this history, but just for fun, let's go to the next slide. This was the house that we lived in Dover, New Hampshire. They've actually recently, it's 40th anniversary of the Turtles this year, and they recently put a manhole cover that I helped design with locals that lived up there, James Lane and the Woodman Museum and stuff. And this house no longer exists, but it was a house that Peter and his wife Janine were renting, and they had a room available. And that's where, after cooking lobsters in Maine for the tourists one summer, I moved to Dover, New Hampshire, about 30 minutes away, and Peter and I formed Mirage Studios. And Mirage Studios was named after the fact that it was quite simply a mirage. It wasn't a studio. It was our living room, and that's my actual desk. I actually couldn't afford a desk in those days, so I had this overstuffed chair that I found in, driving by the street, you see one of those signs for free. Grabbed this overstuffed chair and used to draw on a lap board. And Peter's desk was, he's the one that took the picture. His desk was right across from mine. And so this is where we decided to brainstorm and come up with ideas on how to make our fortune in comics, submitting loads and loads and loads of ideas and samples and trying to find work. Got a lot of rejection letters. And as the story goes, this next panel is fun because this was one night, Peter and I were working on a character we created called the Fugitoid, which we later rolled into All Things Turtles. And I had this idea: if Bruce Lee was an animal, what would be the stupidest animal? Bruce Lee would be fast-moving martial artist, slow-moving turtle. It made me laugh. Did this sketch and I put it on Pete's desk, and I said, "This is going to be the next big thing." Ha ha ha. It got the laugh that I wanted, and then Pete did a version, changed some things, improved some things, which led to this next drawing, which was a group shot of, we figured if one, why not a group, and thinking maybe like the Fantastic Four, the X-Men. So I did a pencil drawing of 4 turtles, each with different weapons, had penciled in this Ninja Turtles comic logo, and then when Pete did the final inks on it, he added Teenage Mutant to the title, and we just fell in love with it immediately. It was something that we didn't want to send out as a sample or try to sell it to somebody. It's something that we liked, and there was a lot of self-publishing starting to really evolve off the early late 60s, early 70s. Underground comics self-publishing became a bit more of a viable opportunity through selling only directly to comic book stores as a non-returnable opportunity. So that's where we started the idea. And so it was like, well, let's keep these characters for ourselves. Let's come up with a story that tells how they got to be the Ninja Turtles. So we started day to day working on where do they come from? What's their what's their story? And again, borrowing heavily on comics, anything from Frank Miller's Daredevil, with things like our evil clan of ninjas in our story is called the Foot. In Daredevil, they had a group of ninjas called the Hand. Even one of Daredevil's mentors was a character named Stick that Frank Miller brought into the series. We had Splinter. You see where this is going. And so we picked all these things we loved about comic books and started bringing them into the thing. And one of the things that's most often asked at comic book shows is, where did you come up with the names of the turtles? And I love to say that, not only was I a geek, a really, back when geek was not a pleasant term, and thanks to Big Bang Theory, they made it much cooler. In high school, I not only loved comic books, but I also loved art history. And this was a painting I did, graduating class of 1980 in Westbrook High School. It was my tribute to Leonardo da Vinci, which was, he was a hero to me because he did everything. He's a scientist and artist and painter and sculptor. So, and so when Pete and I were saying, well, what should we call him? Well, because of the Asian influences, we thought traditional Asian names might be something of interest. I made sense, sorry. And, but it wasn't silly enough because we're talking about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so American names, Doug, Bob, Steve kind of thing was still not funny enough. So I said, well, why don't we go really to the furthest extreme and how about like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. And that got the laugh out of both of us. And that's where we sort of stuck with that. In fact, I often tell a story about the fact that before Donatello was named Donatello, I was a big fan of a sculptor named Bernini. And so Donatello was almost named Bernini, but whether it was a smart decision or a flip of the coin, I don't remember exactly, but we went with Donatello. So as we worked through who the bad guys were, Shredder and where the origin is, falling into the sewer, and the exposure to the mysterious ooze that was used a lot in comics in those days, the Fantastic Four being exposed to gamma rays, or the Hulk with radiation, or Peter Parker being bit by a radioactive spider. We just had a mysterious ooze that we later, explored in more detail in the comic. But so with so we worked through the origin story, and that was next panel, next slide. You'll see is there was a very small comic convention locally where we lived in New Hampshire. May 5th, 1984, and so we geared the completion of the comic book and borrowed money from my uncle Quentin, the earliest form of Kickstarter, family crowdfunding. He lent us basically $1,500 to do the first issue, which was 3,000 copies, and it premiered at this small comic convention, and there we are back 40 years ago. And what was fun this year, the 40th anniversary year of the Turtles, my wife Courtney and I have been doing a lot of shows, and particularly we got to do one very close to the release date. It was the end of April up in Portsmouth, not too far from where the original place, which no longer exists, where we had the convention, the premiere of the first Turtles. And so we had a lot of the original artists that worked with us with Mirage over the years, had an affiliation with the Turtles, as well as Peter, who doesn't do many shows. He doesn't like to travel that much. He came and spent 2 days with the fans, with all of us. It was a wonderful celebration after all this time. The next slide is sort of, I want to go into some of the creation aspects of the comic, which I think what some of you are here to hear more about is approaching designing something and creating something to become a comic book, because it does take quite a bit of work when you think about not only creating your characters, your setting, your universe, locations. It's much like it made sense to me, the approach that we were taking here was similar to what I would find out later. If you were doing a movie, you would, once you wrote a script, screenplay, you would have sets and locations and character designs and all those things. Well, if you're a writer and an artist, that job becomes very simplified, in that you get to control all that, but you need to also create those aspects. And so in our case, where we had both Peter and I drawing at the same time, both penciling, swapping pages back and forth, both inking. We needed to have whether location sheets or character sheets turn around so you could see what they look like back, front, and sideways, so we could keep the drawings consistent. And so we did this series. These were done before the first issue was done. Action poses, facial expressions, just different stuff. And you can see I still love this very organic shape that they had back in '84 before we did the first issue. It stayed consistent with the first issue in this design aspect, but when you look at the turtles as they've steadily evolved, even the work that Peter and I did before it became cartoon or movie and stuff, it was a steady evolution of us learning to draw better, learning to draw, period. We both wrote and drew and told our own stories, very short stories. I did 6-page stories, 5-page stories, 10-page stories. 10 pages was probably about the longest, and I think about the same for Pete. When we did the first issue of the Turtles, it was a 40-page story. And we were both grateful that there was two people handling all the chores. But it was the first chance we had to take a big bite and tell a very large-scale, epic story, and get everything in there that we wanted to, because we never thought there'd be a second issue. That's why the first issue is not only 40 pages long, it's also a complete beginning, middle, and end to the story. The door is left open if we ever got a chance to do a second issue. But the first issue we never thought would sell. The ones that we printed 3,000 copies, as mentioned. Michael Quentin loaned us the money. And the next slide is creation of Splinter, which people said, I told you that the relationship between Stick and Splinter as its inspiration, but where did Splinter come from? Well, the turtles fell into the sewer in New York. I'd never been to New York City at the time, but there was all you heard about New York was pizza, and there's a lot of rats there. And so it made sense that the mutagen and the turtles all fell in the sewer next to a rat, who then, had a much deeper history, but everybody mutated, and that was a start. And when we were trying to come up with the bad guy, who's the main nemesis for the turtles, some of you guys might have heard this story before, but it's actually true. And I use it to reinforce a idea that, there are no stupid ideas, because Peter and I were doing dishes one night while we were talking about the story, different elements we were putting together, the story, the origin of the turtles. And Jeannie didn't cook dinner, and Peter was washing, and I was drawing, and I was drawing one of those cheese graters, those metal triangular sort of cheese graters. And as I had my hand up inside drawing it, I said, man, to Pete, could you imagine if you had a bad guy like this? He'd have the ability to shred your skin off. And that's where, Pete said, well, the shredder. And so this is the first concept I did of the shredder from back in the day. So there are no stupid ideas. Well, there can be, but have fun with it and go with your instincts. This I love showing because you'll see the next slide is it was a drawing I did for Pete's folks, and it's a 1984 version of the Turtles, and it's just funny to sort of see how far they've evolved from that day. But let's get into some of the actual techniques of producing that first issue. For a lot of the issues, for a number of reasons, I felt that, once we didn't work from a final and full script. In some cases these days I do, in some cases I don't. Traditional comics out there, more mainstream comics, say, not only here in the States, but over, in Europe and abroad, and maybe not as much in Asian countries, but a lot of them will work with a whole team of people. There'll be a writer, a penciler, an inker, and the colors. But for Pete and I, it was just two of us, and we knew it was going to be black and white. And so we did an outline, talked out the story. It was a beat sheet of maybe about 10 or 12 pages, handwritten on yellow line paper. And then from that, it was enough to me that, and it still remains to this day, when you're actually doing the layouts, which is the page to page, panel to panel of what you need to do to tell the story. That's where the story evolves. It's a naive approach in that, say most comics have 20 to 22 pages, sometimes 24. In the early days, they were a bit longer, but they have a strict structure and a format. So you need to fit just the specific amount of story in each of those pages to get to where you want to tell a complete segment of that story, or a full story before you go to the next issue. And with us, is that we really didn't have a set number of pages, although in this case, for issue 1, it was 40 pages. But later issues, we got to, it could be 32 or 35 or 37. It was whatever we we wanted to do, because we were not only the writers, the artists, the publishers, the editors. We did everything so we could decide how long it could be or how short it could be. So after this, say 12-page breakdown, I then started doing layouts. And once the layouts, as you can see on the far left, were very basic, gave us a general placement, and then the middle panel is the final inked version. And as I mentioned earlier, that Peter and I both write and draw, and so we wanted to share the task. So when we started penciling these pages, we decided that we would pencil the entire 40-page issue, passing them back and forth in the same studio. So there was some of our drawing by each of us on each, not every panel, but most every panel on every page. And once all the 40 pages were penciled, then we inked them the same way, passing them back and forth. Then this very interesting technique, I don't know if you are very familiar with and I've got a few other examples here that give you some more detail. When you see in the far right, there's got the pages have this tone quality to it, and it's a paper that doesn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, you can do some of these techniques on a computer, but back in those days, it was a very common type of paper. It was either called craft tint, or in our case, it was called duo shade. And the duo shade paper was very much like any drawing surface you would have, a Bristol board, but it had these blue lines, very faint. You couldn't see a non-repro blue lines, 2 patterns, going, cross-hatching. And you would develop them through, one chemical that was a light chemical that would develop the lines going in one direction. The other would be a dark chemical, which would develop the lines going in both directions. So you'd get not only, it was used a lot for newspaper illustrations. Mad Magazine, which was a lot of it was in black and white, would do this so that you would have this black and white, but 2 shades of gray that you could add to your dimension. And the fun part was when you did the art, like, let me see, do the next slide. And I think the next one, let me see, that was page 1 of the Turtles. The next one, this is page 5, and it's a similar approach. There's my original layouts. Obviously, very, very Frank Miller Ronin influenced. Loved the open panels, the breakdowns, the pacing, the action sequences that were arranged very cinematically, which to me I just absolutely adored. That kind of pacing. And so they have the layouts, then the pencil, which then became the inks, and then the duo shades. And if you go to the next panel, this shows it a little bit more in a sepia tone, because when you do the duo shade, this is what the originals look like. And this was the first page to Turtles issue 3, which was just amazing that when I think that after issue 1, when we got to issue 3, I get to issue 2, we actually started drawing comics full time, and that's really in many ways where the dream came true for Peter and I. Was we now didn't have to work any other odd jobs, any of anything else, that we're actually following the footsteps of our heroes, the Kirbys and the Millers and the Corbins. So this is issue 3, and then the introduction of Casey Jones and a Raphael one-shot. But there's a good example on the next slide is the cool part of when you have these originals that you pencil ink and then do the tones work, they look sepia. which gives it a very beautiful look. And we've occasionally printed them in that format, but when you photocopy them for black and white reproduction, they come out like you see here on the right, which is all those tones, all those hash marks and everything translate into black and white quite wonderfully. And I think that was one of the early attractions to the series too, is that it was different from what other people were doing. It wasn't just a black and white comic book. It gave us this black and white shades of gray. It gave it a very unique different kind of feel to it. And so we can talk about, if you have more questions on Duo Shade when we get to questions, we can definitely go back to that. And they said it doesn't really exist anymore. I've got probably the last stash of it, not only the original chemicals, which are impossible to find, but the paper itself. But these days with computer and effects, you can do a lot of this very similarly. So on the next slide, let me see. I wanted to go to when we did the original layouts, like you saw with issue 1, they evolved a little bit into I was still doing a lot of work on yellow line paper, which is just a fun sort of, middle step, storyboard step. And you could sort of, you didn't care about it that much, but you would do these basic layouts and roughs and have fun with it, play with it, make your border notes. And then one of the things that Pete and I noticed early on is sometimes there'd be cases where on the yellow line paper, if you wanted that same feel to translate onto the page, the final finished pages, you would lose some of the movement and some of the looseness, because then they're like, oh, well, that's just a loose layout. Here I'm doing something very specific. It needs to be, so it would sort of tighten up and you lose some of the energy. And so I switched to by issue 5 and 6. These are 2 pages from issue 6. I started taking the same approach to working off a bead sheet and then doing my layouts, but doing them kind of loosely and quickly in blue pencil, but then tightening them up with pencil. And they were done 2 size, which then we would go to a photocopy, get them Xeroxed and enlarge them a bit larger, and then light table them onto the Duo Shade paper. So we were able to keep that fluidity and that movement and that energy that you had in the original layouts into the final pages. So here's a couple of samples of that. That was issue 6. The next slide is issue 7. Again, see some of the details it gives you. Again, you still are approaching it not as quote unquote the final page, but you can work on your composition and sort of getting some of the movement, some of the pacing that works. And still, you're not working off a finished page, which then you go, oh, that didn't work, and going back and have to change it. We could still troubleshoot and solve stuff at this stage, which then when you translate it into the final pages that you would enlarge to pencil and ink, you'd sorted out some of those problems. And this next slide is one of my favorite issues, which was a huge influence on us on the self-publishing realm. Was in the mid-70s. A creator in Canada named Dave Sim created a character called Cerebus the Aardvark, and he approached it in a parody element where it was drawn very much like Barry Smith's Conan the Barbarian, and it was done in that same kind of Barry Smith style, but it was an animal character existing in a human world and running around acting like Conan the Barbarian. And so in issue 8 was a crossover between Turtles and Cerebus the Aardvark, which was one of my favorites, because we introduced a character called Renette, which was a kind of a time-traveling mistress that we were inspired by Mickey Mouse and Fantasia, but also Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits. Loved the fact that this person could go to different universes and make things happen, even though it was kind of that Sorcerer's Apprentice where things didn't always turn out well, but it left a door and an opportunity. And we've used Renette through almost every single Turtle incantations, from the comics to all the cartoons and some of the movies. So so this was some of the systems of working in early days. I thought you'd like to see some, because there's always a lot of steps between your idea, if you yourself are looking at telling a story and how to approach to tell a story, whether it's a big story, even a small story. The steps are very similar. Um, and it just gives you an insight of how we did it. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And like I said, neither Pete and I went to, school for this. It was just sort of finding our path just by using, I guess, what we thought worked for us. We wrote the stories for us. Even in the earliest days of the Turtles, we were lucky that we never approached the story in that, hey, if we kill off a character, or if we do this and this, maybe we'll get more sales, or maybe we do this. It was never pandering to say, if we do this, the fans will like this, because we're very much one of you all. We were fans, and so we wrote those stories of like, if if we could do it, this is how we'd do it, and so the stories were very much written for us, and that's something I still use today, 40 years later. I want to skip to this is kind of a fun, and I'm taking a few leaps, obviously, because otherwise this this couple hour session we're going to hang out together would probably be about 9 hours, because I tend to talk a lot, and I love to talk, and especially to people that are interested in what I'm saying, because I love this stuff. And this next slide is I'm going to jump to the yellow line paper situation again, because it was always something that I used in some of the early days of the Turtles, and it's kind of a system that if you're feeling like, well, it's just my notes, and it's just I'm sort of just figuring this out now, and I'm using it, and that by the time I was working on the this is from the IDW Turtles run. This was issue 21, so this would have been probably 25 years after issue 1, or so, a little bit later. And in this one story, I had this idea that if you look on the yellow line paper on the left hand side, sorry, the whole story's right there. I had this idea. It was very simple in its approach. The Turtles are always using their same basic weapons, and Splinter, who was inspired by Bruce Lee, Jeet Kune Do, using all forms of martial arts to be a better warrior, which is something that a lot of MMA guys use these days. But learn all martial arts form and become the ultimate warrior by doing that. And so he was going to teach them a lesson. So he made himself into this unknown assassin and sort of took him to task to broaden their horizons. But the whole story's on the left hand side, and then I started doing layouts, and I liked the simplicity again. As I did all the finishes myself, the finished pencils and inks, I literally blew up the panels on the right hand side, and pretty much light tabled them in a larger size and did the finishes that way. And it just sort of wanted to stick with it, good, bad, or ugly, if the proportions weren't right, if everything wasn't right, but it's still kind of fantastical, and it was sort of in my style, and I could make adjustments on the way. So this was something, if you're just sitting in your studio, you're riding a bus or in the library, and you have ideas, keep a legal pad and make your notes, because you can those things is something you can always go back to and play with and refine. And this next slide, again, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but I just want to show you, 'cause I know we're already coming up on, we're into 40 minutes, and I want to make sure we get plenty of time for questions. This was just a fun thing I want to show you, to keep showing you some different things over the years. And this was a cover that I had penciled for the 30th anniversary of the Turtles that Peter inked. It's just such a wonderful, blending of styles that we've still, even after all that time, it was like going and visiting an old friend, which is pretty much what it was. I did the pencils, Peter did the inks, and you can see a couple of the stages that he so wonderfully photographed, the steps into the finished piece. And the next slide, jumping around a little bit more, and this is I don't know if any of you out there know an artist named Simon Bisley. Simon Bisley's a UK artist that has done so many wonderful things, from Slain to he worked for 2000 AD, Slain, ABC Warriors. He did the Batman Judge Dredd crossover. He co-created a character called Lobo with DC. And I've worked with Simon on numerous projects, and we did this project based on our mutual love of John Woo, who had just come into popularity at the time with this Hong Kong movie. He's the first guy to, the sideways gun holding, shoot 'em ups, Better Tomorrow, Bullet in the Head, The Killer, that kind of stuff. And so we decided we're going to do this longest running gunfight in comic books and we called it Body Count, and it starred just Casey and Raphael. And what I did with Simon, and Simon is can be very ADHD. I mean that in the kind of sense, I could tell him something and he's forgotten what I told him, a few minutes later. And so all the work that Simon and I did together and many projects over the years, it was very similar to something that I did with Pete back in the day, and which is doing all the breakdowns and doing the basic designs. And so this is for a reprint cover of when they did a collected of it. So I would send Simon the Blue Line concept on the far left, and then Simon inked it and then painted it. And it is great to it was never with anybody I work with, especially say Pete or a couple other artists that I'll show you here in a sec, is you don't want to approach it as a authoritarian or dictator, so to speak, although it's very important in stories. And I think what worked very well for Pete and I is if you had somebody in the driver's seat and you had a co-pilot, somebody riding shotgun, and you were open, there was no ego, that it was a free flow of sort of ideas, but you still need somebody to sort of keep the story or the images on track, that keeps it into the same, so it doesn't veer too far left and right and you lose the power of the story. So with Simon, it was great for everything that we did. I would do layouts like I did with Pete and a lot of other artists I work with, and the results of him knowing that he doesn't have to stick to my designs exactly unless he really likes it. In this case, he did, and the results are just fantastic. And it's a wonderful combination, and you do get a lot of energy when you work with other people, as I have with Pete from the very beginning to others along the way. Like this next one is we all know Bill Sienkiewicz. Or I hope if you don't know Bill Sienkiewicz, please look him up. He's just a fantastic, the original artist that came into comics very much inspired, like we were, following in the footsteps of, in Bill's case, Neil Adams. He was very influenced by Neil's style, and had that hyper sort of realistic, yet still superhero approach to Moon Knight and other things he was doing when he first came into comics. But then he brought in a lot of his art school influence and illustration influence, from Bob Peak to Bernie Fuchs to so many other popular illustrators that were doing those fantastic illustrations for Time Magazine or Newsweek, or and brought this real illustrative, panel-y style and an approach to telling stories that was very different. And he really exploded with a series called New Mutants, which was a big influence also for us with the Turtles, Teenage Mutants, which been a theme in comics for many years. But what he did with it. But I would see him. We became friends over many years, and we always wanted to work together. So I came up with a story that was going to run in a series of sequences in a book called Turtle Universe. And it was like 24 pages, I think, in the end, ran in 5-page segments. So I provided Bill with the layouts, and he's also, I've known him for a long time, and he's a bit of Simon in the same sense that he can be a little ADHD in that, working on a number of projects at the same time and also get a little distracted. And for me to keep the story on track, not only for myself, doing the layouts and then giving him the layouts of here's the story that we want to tell, here's the bullet points, and there's the notes on the side so you know what's going on in the panel, and you just have at it. He stuck fairly close, in some cases, really close to some of the designs and layouts that I was doing, which I was surprised because I was, I told him again, I said, this is just my suggestion. You have at it and do something fun with it. And I think he liked the comfort of knowing where it was going, so he could just not have to think about working off a finished typewritten script and then first thinking like, okay, I've got to get these on the page. This is how I need to arrange them. This is what I need the story where it starts coming in. This is where it has to start going out. And with that kind of done with the layouts, all you had to think about was having fun with the actual drawing. And I think that was what was exciting about this this process. And so hopefully I'll get to work with him again one day. He's a fantastic artist. So this, actually, we're doing pretty good. Time-wise says, I want to get into, again, I skipped through this, 40 years of turtle history, and this is, I'd spend 9 hours with you if I could. Maybe we'll be invited back. We'll do some more of these. But I wanted to get into a series that came out in 2022 called The Last Ronin. And I think some of you have probably heard of it. It's something that was amazingly successful, so much farther than what Tom and I thought it would be when we approached it. We would just hope we had this really great idea for a story, and I'll get a bit more into the history when it came time to do it. But it was, we said, well, if it at least sells as much as the regular ongoing Turtle series, this was sort of a step outside of it, then that'd be great. At least we can cover the cost and we could tell a really great story. But the history to The Last Ronin and some of these notes you see here is Peter and I had, we completed Turtles issues 1 through 11, which was a very long series of story arcs. We kind of basically created the foundation, what became the structure of almost all things Turtles in the Turtle universe with issue 11. But there was also 4 one-issue microseries, a single issue featuring an individual turtle. So out of those first 15 issues, we covered everything that we wanted to at that point. We've established all of the locations, the settings, the supporting characters, April O'Neil, Casey Jones, the Foot, just there was all those pieces were there. And we were thinking, well, where do we go from here? And these are some actual notes. Some of the black and white and the highlighted ones are stuff that I've added since, and I'll tell you about that in a sec. But we said, well, let's set a story that might be the final Turtle story, set 30 years in the future. So in 1987, we sat down and we together wrote out it's about a 23, 24-page outline of the story set in 2017. And it was, again, the final Turtle story. That was the same year, 1987, is when we started working on the cartoon series and the Turtles toy series. The first Turtles cartoons came out in the Christmas break, the end of 1987, between Christmas and New Year's. The first Turtle toys came out in June of 1988, and talk about buckling up your seatbelt and hanging on for dear life when things took off, because Peter and I were in full control of everything, all things Turtles. The first 20 years of anything any fan saw of the Turtles, comics, toys, cartoons, everything, Peter and I had direct hands-on work in it, full approval on it and stuff. So suddenly this idea that we'd written set 30 years in the future in 87, suddenly it was 5 years later and we hadn't gotten to it, and it was 10 years later we hadn't gotten to it, and then eventually shelved indefinitely as the Turtles universe grew and expanded. So fast forward to 2011, the Turtles had been purchased by Viacom, and Pete retired fully. I had been stepped away for the Turtles creatively. I'd been working on some other things. I bought Heavy Metal Magazine and was doing a number of other projects. And so with the Turtles relaunch in 2011, IDW invited me back to work on the Turtles, which Turtles have never been far from me, and I've always loved them and always will. So I jumped at the chance to go back and work with a wonderfully creative team at IDW. Tom Waltz, who's the head writer, who's wrote 100 issues of Turtles, which I'll get to in a sec, and then the different artists that worked with in the Turtles came back with a vengeance, so to speak, but an approach that was very similar to the earliest Turtles comics. They were done for written for an older audience, the original fans of the Mirage series. So it was a bit more intensity. It wasn't the cartoon show or anything like that. And so we said, well, if we can get through 12 issues, it'd be great. Then we were approaching issue 50 and we were blown away. Oh my God, I can't believe we've been able to tell all these new Turtle stories, create this new foundation, this new Turtle universe up to issue 50. Then we're approaching issue 100 and even more kind of blown away at this opportunity to have now worked on the Turtles for 11 years and having just the time of our life. And as we were approaching issue 100, we basically said, Tom and I were talking once and we said, well, where do we go from here? And I said, well, I've got a story that Peter and I developed in 1987, and it's been, basically, and we're talking 2018, so it was literally a year after Pete and I had originally written it to take place in 2017. So in 2018, we're talking about it, and I broke down the basic concept of the story, and I said it's essentially a love poem to Frank Miller's Dark Knight. It's the final Turtle story, and it's this, and it has all these elements. And I said the only way I'd want it to go ahead is if Nickelodeon, who owned the Turtles, Viacom Nickelodeon, if they approved me doing all the final writing with Tom. I did all the final writing, all the final layouts, all the final designs, 40-page issues. I wanted it to be intense and really intended for that older audience, but even go harder and give it more of an edge. And Nickelodeon, who's always been very supportive to that stuff, gave us the thumbs up. And so I spent about 7 or 8 months beating the whole rest of the story out, expanding it from a 23-page outline, which would have been roughly a 80 to 100-page story to a full 200-page outline. And then at that point, once Tom issued issue 100, we stopped. We oversaw the rest of the Turtle line, but we stopped direct involvement in the Turtles ongoing series and switched gears fully to Last Ronin. And so with Last Ronin, in this next slide, you see that I wanted to go back in a way that was so much like the earliest issues. I wanted to have those original designs like I showed you in issue 1. I wanted to develop who the Last Ronin was, which to me was always Michelangelo. He was the first turtle drawn, even before he was named Michelangelo. He, to me, was the best to not only use to tell the most powerful story that I wanted to tell, that we wanted to tell, but he was a character that most people knew him as the more laid-back turtle, so he would have the farthest to go to become this ultimate vehicle of vengeance and redemption and the last turtle standing in every sense of the word. And so these are some of the first doodles I have of what he would look like, but the kind of detail I like, much like being a fan of movies, I'm a huge fan of anime, just so many things that I like to know every aspect of who this character is and what he's going to look like and the things that he's going to have. So like you see on the right hand, this is his costume broken down piece by piece. And this is something so that if I know it, and I'm taking the approach now to Last Ronin that I wanted to be not too dissimilar to approaches to other turtle stories that I oversaw more directly. And as Point was back in the driver's seat fully, I took the approach of like a director for a movie. But I wanted to know it better than anybody else, that if I was telling an artist, the people that I was going to be working with on it, including Tom, who was a co-writer, and we created a lot of the aspects together, but I wanted to know it best. And this is the scene. So every aspect from the actual design of what Michelangelo is, when you go to the next slide, is I sort of arrived at this final look for what his character looks like. And he doesn't change that much from that through the entire series. This is back in 2020 when, I'd been developing this now for a while. And as we started getting into the actual series, approaching the series of what it was going to be, again, thinking much like a love poem to things like Dark Knight. It reminded me very strongly of Clint Eastwood's movie Unforgiven, as this grizzled old gunfighter that's basically going to set everything right, and he's going to solve. I want to say it's a better word for it. He's the one that's gonna end. He's the one that's got to end the story of all that had been created for the original Turtles. This is going to be the final character, because every story that Peter and I have done, and every version of the stories that's been told since, whether it be the cartoon series, the movies, it was all about this feud between Rokusaki and Hamato Yoshi. It was the Foot Clan versus Clan Hamato, and it was this blood feud that had gone on now for all these years. And if you kind of quote unquote remove the bloodline, and the theory is that would end it. And that's sort of what Michelangelo was doing, because he'd lost the whole rest of his family because of this feud. And so I thought of Unforgiven. So if you go to the next slide, it's really fun with the Bill Sienkiewicz, again, friend and a big influence. The drawing on the left is one of his his painted concepts for the Unforgiven movie poster. So I took that, adapted it, and this is my version that I then sent to the Scorza brothers, which I'll talk about in a sec. So if you go to the next slide, it's I said, this is what I want. I want the character from the back. You can't tell who he is, which turtle he is, which is how I designed it from the first issue, although you find out at the end of the issue that it's Michelangelo, because I wanted you to know who you are investing your all your feelings and your your story focus is now to follow this character. But from the back, I wanted you to have, you'd see all the weapons from all the turtles, the nunchucks of the size, the Leonardo sword, and Donatello's bow staff. So you didn't know which turtle it was as you started moving through the series and started in this first issue. So that's the final cover with the Scorza's pencils and the color work. What's interesting in the next slide is, as I mentioned earlier, and you can go to some of the, if you've ever seen some of the publications, either on our website or some of the actual physical published books by IDW, there's a director's cut of Last Run-In, which shows a lot of my designs. But it was my intent, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, that I had to know the story and the locations, because it was set in the future better than anybody else. I can't direct anybody to do the finished work, which was my decision to work with the Scorza brothers and Ben to do the finishes on this. But I had to show them what the characters look like, what the locations were, from the alleyways to the sets, to the lair, to the different pieces. So there's probably about 200 or 300 drawings I done at this detail, which is also funny. Before they did the new Robert Pattinson Batman movie, I did New York City recovering from climate change, and it was being flooded. So there's a big wall around the city to hold the water back. So, so there's a lot more designs if this kind of stuff fascinates you, because it also is. I love the design work, and this is something that going back to Turtles 10 and 11, designing the farmhouse that the turtles went out to when they left New York and went out to Northampton, those kind of things. If you knew the location, it made it easier for you to think about what you wanted to tell in a story. So once you knew the location, you could then focus on things like the emotion or what you're trying to convey in the moment, without having to think of like, well, is this the side of the barn? Is it the top of the barn? That kind of thing. So with Last Run-In is very important that I know where the location, I could then focus on the storytelling once I decided where it was going to be. But the coolest part is the artists that I had worked with at Heavy Metal Magazine, Isaac and Esau Escorza. They're from Mexico City, and they speak very little English, and I speak very little Spanish. And so, like I said, I'd worked with them on a couple of short stories in Heavy Metal, and they did a Tarna series for me in Heavy Metal. And so I would send them Tom and I would send them kind of a simplified script, but then I would send them the visuals of, this is the alleyway, this is the lair, this is what the city looks like, all the designs of the characters, and then I would send them the layouts. If you go to the next slide, you can see the similar to some of the early approaches going back, whether it be the pencil slides and layouts and things that I did with Pete in the earliest days, to the transition to some of the more detailed blue pencil outlines, to even the yellow line paper lines. I would do all the layouts. And it's funny, I was going to mention two quick things that I got out of the. This is if you're ever looking to do storyboards, this is a real great. This is just Post-it notes. This is comic book page size, 4x6. And so a lot of times before I did some of the final panels, I would do like a really quick marker rough on a Post-it note before I then did the finishes. But all the things that we talked about in the book, that's the cover. I always liked including all of the story beats in one large sketchbook. So every design, everything that you've seen in the story, the layouts, the concept, everything was done in here, including this was almost all designs before we then get to the layouts. So then if you go back to the layouts for a sec, and then we're almost done. I think I've just got a couple of the slides, and then we can talk. So for the entire 200-page story, I did detailed layouts with my story notes on the side. Again, working off more of a beat sheet than it wasn't it wasn't a final finished script, because the dialogue, the pacing, the page to page was happening and evolving as we were telling stories. Like Tom and I would talk out, the broad strokes for the issue, kind of like what Pete and I did in the earliest issues, and then I'd do the layouts. And from that, we'd then sort out the dialogue, make adjustments and tweaks, and move through it almost like, again, what you might see a director do with a storyboard artist as they approach how they're going to shoot a movie, what the scenes are going to be, where the action's coming in, where the cars are coming in, where this, just all those beats, how they all connect. And so I provide these to the Scorza brothers. And then in this next panel, it's got their 2 pages adapting those layouts that I just showed you. So I said, here's the beats, what the story is. You can tell by the dialogue. And then they did pencils and inks. And the coolest thing about the Scorza brothers, if you find them out there online or see some of they're doing more signings, and I think they had some short videos and stuff of how they work together, but they're identical twins, and they both draw and pencil at the same time, sometimes on the same sheet of paper. Like they're literally joined. And I talked about Peter and I sort of trying to mind melt 2 different styles to make it work in the early stages of the Turtles. But with the Scorza brothers, they're 2 people, most amazing people, but they literally, I've seen them actually like at a convention, if they're doing sketches, I've seen, one of them would reach over and do something on one of the other guy's drawings. And it's not like, it's egotistical or fixing something, or it's just, they're literally working on the same brain, and they are just incredibly fantastic creators. And I am so lucky that I found them through heavy metal and got to create and work with them through Last Ronin 1, and now we're doing Last Ronin Part 2 right now. And then the other artist as part of the series was a good friend from Maine, creator I worked with on a series called Drawing Blood, my buddy David Avalone. But I brought Ben specifically in to do the flashbacks. But if you've seen Last Ronin, you probably know this. If you're not, check it out. It's a neat sort of, the Scorza brothers sequences were all designed like Dark Knight here and now kind of story, and the flashbacks were going back to what happened to different moments in time. And I wanted them kind of designed like Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One. So I was sort of mixing Dark Knight, which was Frank Miller and Klaus Janson, with Batman Year One intercut to some of the flashbacks. One of the things I want to show you in the next slide is one of the guys that I was so incredibly lucky to find as well is because I think a colorist can make or break a story in some cases. And we were lucky to find a colorist. Luis Antonio Delgado is also from Mexico City. Just a fantastic, he's an artist, but he's a really incredible colorist. And he brought these pages and these panels to life in a way that more than we all hoped for, and it was fantastic. So I'm going to go through the last couple of slides, and it was just showing, again, I feel like I could have spent a lot more time on all of this stuff, but I'd love to give you some broad strokes and we get to the questions. So I just jumped to one of my favorite evolutions of a spread and one of the final action sequences in book 4 before we get to the final showdown in book 5. So there's my layouts. And if you go to the next panel, it's the Scorza brothers just taking it 10 steps further down the road and just absolutely killing it. By now, it's sort of like we'd all become part of one brain, if you will. We'd now done, let me see, this is probably 140 pages, 150 pages of work so far together in this system. And so by now we were really hitting a rhythm, and some of these issue 4 and 5, the rest are great, but these are 4 and 5 really were cranking. And then the final slide is Lewis's color on that. I had fun. I was teasing because kept trying to, if you look at some of the coloring closely, you can see a lot of spatter work, and something I've always done. And I kept saying, Lewis, your work is beautiful. It's really clean, but I want it to have a bit of, think of the opening sequences for Save It Private Ryan, or the evolution of war movies, where you see dirt everywhere, every scene with something's flying and something's dirt brings a realism to it. So if I've added anything to Lewis's incredible work, it's getting him to add spatter to some of his his coloring pages. So that's the visual part of the presentation. It was I hope that was fun for you. I spent quite a bit of time to sort of go through and give you 40 years of history in a way that hopefully, doesn't look like anybody signed off or fell asleep yet.
I don't think there's any fear of that, Kevin. And thank you so much. That was fantastic. That was amazing. And
Thank you.
What we're going to do now, everyone, is we're going to segue into the next portion of the class. So what will happen is the recording will end, but don't worry, the chat won't end. We're still going to go live, but we're going to go straight into a Q&A. So prior to this class, I would have reached out to all the attendees saying if you had any questions in advance. If a question has come to you subsequently in the class, we'll get to you as well. We have a running order of Academy students and members first, and then certificate holders, and then we'll work our way through then any Q&As. At the end of the screen, you'll see a reaction button. The reaction button will allow you to use the raise the hand function, and we can call upon you in that order as well once we clear the first part of the Q&A. I'm going to end the recording now, so this Q&A will be exclusive to you, the participants, and what you've seen has been recorded so far and will be shared and broken up across social media at a later stage. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Kevin. Thanks again, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you can, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps to grow the channel and spread the word about TASQ Art. We'll have more episodes like this coming up in the very near future. And remember, there's a new episode of Creator in Conversation which drops every Tuesday. Just a little outward note as well about the Tallaght Academy of Sequential Art, TASQ Art. We're not just about delivering classes and workshops. We also support creators by offering designated studio space on our campus here in Tallaght at the Edge, Dublin. And we also have on-site publication facilities, so we can publish short press, help you get your prints ready for conventions. And we also have a designated online storage for our publishing arm, Lightning Strike Comics. So if you're an indie creator, you've just discovered us, you're watching this episode, and you would like some support in your developing of your ideas or publishing or distribution, feel free to send us a message at info@tasqart.com and inquire about our membership and how that might be able to be of interest or support to you in your projects. Until next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.